Joining me today. My name is Sheila Parkins, and I'm just one of the program analysts in the Homeless Services section. Today, I'll be providing training to ensure that the CAA network has the information they need to submit their 2025-27 Biennium Master Grant materials. This session will focus on the submission requirements related to the General Required Documents Funding Application and the HSS Program Standards Guidance. Since this is a pre-recorded training, you will be able to pause, back up, fast forward, and watch this at any time, any day, and it will remain available for the duration of the biennium. Use this training for new staff or as a refresher to current staff at any time to meet your needs. So let's dig in. Listeners of this training will not hear information about how to submit a smart sheet or information related to general capacity questions, subrecipient identification, or any program specific training. This training will specifically focus on the required documents and the HSS program standards guidance. More information and training videos are available on our MGA dashboard. Feel free to watch those videos as needed. We'll start with the required documents funding application. First, we have a very handy policy template guide on our MGA dashboard that will help to ensure that you are including every element that is requested of a policy so that we minimize any return of policies for correction. Even if you don't use the template itself, please be sure to review it to make sure that you have all the required elements in each policy that must be submitted and for those that must be kept on file. Some policies require prior approval and must be submitted every biennium for review and approval. Each policy template has general language that we expect to see, and then specific write-in elements or questions relevant to your agency to which you can respond. The required documents smart sheet also includes a link to the newly developed program standards guidance. This link is also available on our MGA dashboard. Be sure to right click and open in a new tab any links or copy and paste the links into a new tab if opening a link from a Smartsheet form. If you move away from a Smartsheet form as you're entering it, you will lose everything you entered up to that point. So be sure you're opening any links in a new tab. The program standard guidance puts together the duplicated elements of each program's manual into a single location. This ensures consistency between programs during updates and provides one place for agencies to go to for all relevant common program requirements. Again, always right click and open in a new tab any links within a Smartsheet so that you don't lose your place and accidentally exit out of your Smartsheet form. Policies are essentially the same as the last biennium with two exceptions. We have a new optional policy for engagement incentives. If you plan on using EHAP general funds for that purpose, you will need to have this policy. As we have one revised policy, which is the confidentiality policy. More information on that shortly. On the screen, you see an example for a template related to the duplication of benefits policy. As you can see, it has a general policy statement that describes this as being your agency's policy to ensure that participant benefits are not duplicated within OHCS funded programs, and states that if a duplication occurs, your agency will return the duplicate payment to OHCS within 30 days. You can do that either through a negative request for funds or voiding the request for funds and rebooking the expenses on your end. If you need more information on how to accomplish a return of funds, reach out to our fiscal staff. Next in the template, there are open-ended questions that help you specify the policy details relative to your agency. For this policy, we ask that you identify how you will ensure that benefits are not duplicated. So you identify what is the process for ensuring that. And two, what systems do you check for duplicate benefits, such as HMIS or ALITA or any other system that you might be using? This is generally what the templates look like. So if you follow the template for each policy and answer each of the open-ended questions relative to your agency's processes and procedures, you should be able to meet the requirements of the policy without a lot of back and forth from OHCS. Remember, all policies identified in the Smart Sheet must be prior approved before your agency can expend any homeless services dollars. This is true even if the specific program IR's funding application or budgets were already approved. On this slide, we're just sharing the list of required policies that must be submitted prior to OHCS loading any funds into OPUS for expenditure. We won't cover each of these in detail, although we will cover a couple of them for which we have seen some need for additional training. Most of these requirements have been around for many, many years, so there really isn't a need to cover them specifically. If you want to review each of these policy requirements, you can go to the HSS Program Standards Guidance document or the Program's Operation Manual, which are all available on the HSS and the MGA dashboards. And be sure to use the policy template document, also available on the MGA dashboard, to ensure that your policies and procedures meet the standards as described in the requirements. And for the purposes of this training, where we state policies, it could refer to policies and procedures. Let's touch on two policies specifically. The first one is the engagement gift card policy. This is a new policy requirement relative to a new allowable use of funds that gives you flexibility to use funds for the purpose of compensating EHAP General Fund clients for participating in surveys and engagement opportunities. You may only use EHAP General Funds for this purpose. As the budget process comes later by a few months, it's important to understand that a budget will not be approved if you allocate funds to the engagement category unless the engagement gift card policy was previously submitted in the required documents funding application and pre-approved by OHCS. It is critical to understand that the approval of a general gift card policy will not extend to the purchase of gift cards for engagement compensation. If it is discovered in monitoring that this occurred, purchases will be disallowed and the grantee will be required to repay the disallowed costs. As this training is focused on general policies, I won't dig into the requirements around engagement compensation. However, more specific details will be covered for this topic in the EHAP, ERA, and SHAP training module, which will be available on the MGA dashboard. Remember, this is an optional policy and there's no requirement to perform surveys or engagement opportunities, and there is no requirement that you have an engagement gift card policy if you do not perform this activity. The other policy I wanted to cover is the confidentiality policy. OHCS provided access to OMB training in October of 2024, and after that training, OHCS determined that there were additional requirements related to the implementation of the new OMB guidance that we hadn't already addressed. There was an additional element of the guidance that applies to OHCS grantees related to cybersecurity and the importance of having policies that address cybersecurity issues. It was determined that this requirement could be easily folded into our confidentiality policy. So this policy has changed significantly. Be sure to review the policy template to assist in the development of this revised policy. But let's look at it together. In order to keep a natural flow to the policy, there are three separate areas in which there are open-ended questions for you to consider about your agency's processes. This is very different than any of our other policies, so be sure that you're following the template. The first three and 3.5 paragraphs are identical to the original confidentiality policy. However, beginning in the fourth paragraph, we state new policy requirements. This has several paragraphs in which the security measures that must be undertaken with maintaining electronic records are covered. We detail requirements on maintaining device security, such as phones, laptops, and other electronic devices, and then the policy goes on to map out the requirements for email security, firewall protection, password security, and employee training. The first open-ended question ends this section by asking for your organization's password requirements, such as passwords must be 12 characters long, include uppercase and lowercase letters, and include at least one special character. If you don't already have another policy that provides this information, you can use this space in this policy to develop it. If you have other policies that provide the level of detail that we are requesting, you may use this space to refer to those policies, such as see Data Security Policy 2.000, located at, and then you provide the link. The next section addresses security measures taken when transferring data and minimizing data breaches. The second question then asks, what are your policies related to social media, internet usage, and other security measures? Again, if you have other policies that provide this information, you may refer to them here or use this space in this policy to develop it. Finally, the policy outlines requirements around cybersecurity and following your organization's policies and procedures. This section ends with the final question, which is to identify your organization's policies related to disciplinary action should employees not follow the requirements of your organization's confidentiality and cybersecurity policy. And again, you can either develop your policy in this space or provide links and information to other organizational policies that provide this level of detail. Policy templates are also available for policies that you must have under specific conditions, but you do not need to submit them to OHCS for prior approval. These are an anti-displacement and relocation assistance policy, which is only applicable if you use funds for rehab or renovation that displaces clients due to the nature of the work. Calculating income applies to your policies and procedures for consistently calculating income between all applicants. All subgrantees and subrecipients must have this policy. However, it does not need pre-approval. Child care in shelter only is applicable if you provide child care in your shelters, which is an allowable expense. Emergency shelter animal policy only applies if you allow animals in your shelters. Internet-related fees, taxes, and equipment policy is only applicable if you use funds to pay for these expenses for clients. Maximum duration and amount limitation policy applies to your policies and procedures on determining how much assistance will be provided and for how long to ensure equitable treatment between clients. This only applies if you limit duration and the assistance amount provided. Safety and service delivery policy only applies if you're providing street outreach services, and it covers the agency's requirements related to keeping outreach workers safe. Transitional housing reassessment policy only applies if you provide transitional housing financial assistance, and it ensures that there is a policy for how reassessments of income are performed and how often. Vehicle repair and insurance policy only applies if you provide this type of financial assistance to clients, and it ensures that there are agency policies on when, how much, and for how long such assistance is provided. If you perform any of these activities, be sure to have these policies and procedures in place for OHCS monitoring purposes. More information on the mechanism for submitting the Smart Sheets and how revision requests will work is found in the 2527 Smart Sheet process and how to submit training module, which you can find on our MGA dashboard. Feel free to watch that video as needed. As a reminder, if there are any insufficiencies identified in your Smart Sheet revision or submission for your policies, Rather than creating multiple back and forth loops, we will connect with you by email, or we can set up a meeting either by phone or Teams chat to cover the insufficiencies with you on a one-on-one basis to help you improve your responses and answer any questions you have. We hope to minimize the time and any confusion during the review process. You will receive an automated revision request through Smartsheets if a revision is requested, and you will receive approval through an automated message in Smartsheets as well if it's approved. Again, see the training module for how to submit Smartsheets if you have questions about the process. As part of the general questions and subrecipient funding application, we asked you to identify your subrecipients. I want to cover some guidance around subrecipients as this is an area that comes up in our fiscal monitoring quite often. All subrecipients must be prior approved by OHCS before you provide the organization with any OHCS funds. This is true whether you are adding them at any time during the biennium or at the beginning of each biennium. You cannot provide OHCS funding to any organization that is not pre-approved by OHCS. For the purpose of this approval, a subrecipient literally means an organization that you are giving funds to. It does not refer to organizations that you may partner with but do not fund. This will include any of your subcontractors, contractors, vendors, subrecipients, and any of their subcontractors, contractors, or subrecipients. Anybody that receives OHCS funds for performing activities related to the delivery of OHCS program services and or financial assistance. Notification and approval normally occurs during the MGA funding application process. However, if changes are made outside of the funding application, subgrantees must submit an implementation report amendment request form for approval of subrecipient additions, deletions, or modifications within 30 calendar days of such a change. No funds can be provided to a subrecipient without OHCS's prior approval, and any expenses incurred prior to OHCS's approval will not be approved or allowed. Program standards are the common elements between all OHCS HSS programs, and all grantees must adhere to the requirements identified in these standards. You can find these standards in the HSS Program Standards Guidance located on the HSS and MGA dashboards. In relation to subrecipients, you must monitor each subrecipient at least once during each biennium. Subgrantees must timely monitor the organization's activities and expenditures of all their subrecipients. You must perform a risk assessment of your subrecipient, and monitoring activities must include a review of a sampling of fiscal transactions, client files, and HMIS entries. You must ensure subrecipients comply with program rules, including record keeping for security, maintenance, retention, and destruction of records. You must also review the asset inventory and any equipment purchases by the subrecipient to ensure compliance with procurement requirements. Remember, subrecipients cannot purchase vehicles, only equipment. And you must include a review of the subrecipient's policies, procedures, forms, documents, and notifications to ensure compliance with program rules. Your documentation of the monitoring you perform on subrecipients must include records of your contract with the subrecipient, their nonprofit status, copies of their audits and any follow-up actions taken, the risk assessment, performance reports, and the review of their record samples. Files should be complete and available to OHCS when we monitor your organization. More information is available in the HSS Program Standards Guidance. Let's touch on eligibility documentation briefly. You must keep documentation of all eligibility determinations. Third-party documentation is the highest preference. Rental and lease agreements are the priority method for documenting a client's housing situation and is the document referred to when ensuring that funds used to pay arrears do not exceed program limitations of 6 months. As a fraud prevention method, if a rental or lease agreement includes a digital signature, it must comply with our digital signature requirements, which must capture the IP address of the signers. Additionally, third-party documentation is a requirement for any payment of mortgage or property taxes. More information is available in the program standard guidance about these requirements. If you allow for a remote application or a remote way of submitting eligibility documentation, you must have a policy that addresses how you go about verifying identity and preventing fraud. Again, more information is available in the guidance. The order of preference is always third-party documentation first, then intake or caseworker observation, which must be documented by the caseworker and may include oral statements made to the worker by shelters, institutions, employers, etc. Finally, the last preference is self-certification, which should only be used when staff are documenting why third-party or intake worker observation are not available. Self-certification must be in writing and documented in the client file. There is also the option to apply a simplified documentation process if you are moving an active client between specific OHCS programs to braid funds, such as between HSP and EHA. This minimizes the need to requalify a client when moving them to another eligible program. To use this process, there can be no lapse in services between the exit from one program and the entry of the other program. A form is available on our website to help facilitate the documentation of using this option. Again, subrecipients must be prior approved before allocating them any OHCS funds. Subrecipients must follow OHCS guidance and specific requirements related to the delivery of OHCS programs, the same as the subgrantee, and must follow all OHCS rules and guidelines. These requirements must be written into the subrecipient contract. Documentation of allowable program components and expenditures must identify how an expense or service helped a participant obtain or maintain permanent housing. OHCS funded assistance provided must be the least amount needed to stabilize clients in their current housing or facilitate their transition into permanent housing. Where state guidance is silent or absent, OHCS-funded programs comply with OMB uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements found at 2 CFR 200. HHS funds expressly prohibit expenditures associated with residential treatment facilities, residential homes, nursing homes, memory care or assisted living facilities, permanent supportive housing, hospitals, jails, and other similar institutions. Funds cannot be used for the purpose of creating or funding landlord damage or loss mitigation programs. I will not go into a lot of detail regarding the renovation and rehabilitation of real property. However, be sure you understand the difference between maintenance and rehabilitation or renovation. There is an appendix to the program standards guidance that provides a comparison between specific activities that will help you determine whether the activity is considered maintenance or rehab renovation. Generally, rehab reno activities do not materially add value to the building or the property, do not appreciably prolong the useful life of the property, and do not adapt the building or property to new use. Any rehab reno activity must receive prior approval by OHCS before you actually begin any activity and before you commit any OHCS funds to the project. There are specific reporting requirements associated with reno rehab activities, which includes semi-annual progress reports until the project is complete, a placed into service report once the project is completed, and an annual certification for the restrictive use period that certifies continued compliance with the guidance. That will be either 3 years for minor rehab or 10 years for major rehab or any prior approved acquisition. Additionally, requirements exist for when you displace current tenants to perform rehab renovation activities, when architectural or general contractor oversight is required, and requirements related to environmental review and inspection. Please read the HSS Program Standards Guidance for additional guidance relative to rehab and renovation of real property. Much of the financial management section that was in the program manuals was moved to the HSS Program Standards Guidance. While most of it is not new information, I'll touch on each element briefly. Fiscal standards have been implemented to ensure more accurate, transparent, and appropriate fiscal controls. It includes 19 specific standards that you are likely already implementing, such as allocating funds in accordance with a cost allocation plan, following your own policies and procedures for fiscal and procurement activities, ensuring errors in bank records are appropriately documented, using an accounting system that can provide prompt and timely reporting of transactions. I won't describe all of them, but more information is available in the HSS Program Standards Guidance. If you need any technical assistance with these standards, please reach out to us. Any advance of funds is allowed, and advance of funds is allowable. However, it must be rare and minimizes the time elapsing between the transfer of funds and the actual expenditure of the funds. Typically, we will look at advances that would allow you to cover expenses for a 30-day period. Such advances must be for the minimum amount needed and timed with the actual immediate cash requirement of your organization in order to carry out the program delivery. You will be required to submit an additional document and upload that to your AGR in Opus that will explain your need. You can find that additional document on our main HSS dashboard. If you ever have questions about an advance of funds, please contact your program analyst. We use Opus as our fiscal system to allocate and draw funds. A video replay of Opus training that covers the basics is available on our main HSS dashboard. Additionally, once you log into Opus, there is a user manual that is available in the menu options. If you need more information about Opus, please let us know. You must retain supporting documentation of all allowable costs charged to a grant and ensure that you have a cost allocation plan that includes all inclusions and exclusions to your indirect cost rate. Submit agency grant requests or the AGRs with supporting documentation such as your general ledger. Submit AGRs at least once every 60 calendar days for every program. Budget change requests move funds between categories in Opus, and you can use the form available on the HSS dashboard and submit it to the mga.fiscal@hts.oregon.gov email address. Budget changes will not be approved if such change would limit the subgrantee's ability to meet minimum percentage standards required by specific program standards, such as ensuring that program delivery costs do not exceed 20% in the HSP grant. Additionally, no budget changes will be approved if submitted within 10 days of the end of the grant's final financial status report period, which is due August 30th, as there is not sufficient time to process a budget change and draw the funds to meet that FSR timeline. I can't stress this enough, but please plan your budget change requests accordingly, as you don't want to get caught being unable to submit a request for funds because you missed the cutoff date. Implementation report amendments are required when you amend your agency's information, such as the legal name or address, when you add, edit, or remove subrecipients, to modify your time-bound expenditure plan, or to add a time-bound expenditure plan if you originally chose a standard plan, or to submit a policy to OHCS for approval. Use the IR amendment form located on the MGA dashboard to request the amendment. Subgrantees are expected to fully expend grant funds during the grant's performance period, and you must meet your spending targets, whether standard or time-bound is chosen. Spending below the plan and funds unexpended 60 days after the performance period are subject to rescission of grant funds by OHCS. More information is available in your grant agreement or on the OHCS's available remedies. You are expected to manage expenditures so that services are available throughout the intended service period unless a specific program guidance allows for early expenditure of the funds, such as ERA, HSP, or DERF programs, or if they're due to an award being less than $25,000. We would not expect you to keep those funds available during the biennium if there was less than $25,000 in your grant allocation. Your MGA addresses risk mitigation for fraud. Subgrantees and their subrecipients are responsible for maintaining an internal controls framework that assures compliance with program requirements. Subgrantee and subrecipients must establish and maintain clear policies and procedures for the management of program applicants, participants, and grantee staff who may have committed fraud and for dealing with public complaints regarding potential fraud. Such policies and procedures must include preventing, detecting, investigating, and dealing with fraud. Any incident of fraud must be reported to OHCS, and subgrantees or subrecipients are responsible for the repayment of funds which were gained or used through any act of fraud. Purchases of equipment or property are subject to additional provisions and requirements as stated in the subgrantee's MGA. Purchases greater than $10,000 must be pre-approved by OHCS. While subrecipients of a subgrantee cannot purchase vehicles with OHCS funds, they may purchase equipment. However, it is the responsibility of the subgrantee that holds the contract with OHCS to follow the requirements for pre-approval. It also needs to be stated that no equipment or vehicle purchased with OHCS funds may be donated to or borrowed by another entity in alignment with 2 CFR 200. Please note that no approval for purchases will be granted in the last quarter of a biennium or performance period, as is applicable, as there's not sufficient time to administer the request and receive the purchase prior to the end of the expenditure period of the grant. Exceptions may be granted for emergency or unforeseen needs, but at OHCS's sole discretion. Purchases requiring OHCS prior approval should be planned appropriately to provide sufficient time to meet processing requirements, and it also speaks to your agency's capacity for planning. So be sure to not wait until the last minute, or a purchase may not be approved. Additionally, title to all equipment where titles are required or vehicles purchased in whole or in part with OHCS funds must rest with the subgrantee. Subgrantee is responsible to provide OHCS with a copy of the title after purchase. Appropriate and legally required insurance must cover property purchased with OHCS funds. Also, any purchase approved by OHCS must also receive OHCS approval before disposing of the property, and any theft or loss of the property must also be reported to OHCS. There are smart sheets available for both the purchase and disposition of vehicles and equipment on the HSS dashboard. Be sure to read the guidance for more information related to procurement. You cannot charge any fee to applicants or clients in order for them to access OHCS funds. I'm sorry, I was a little bit behind on my on my screen share here. I apologize for that. You cannot charge any fee to applicants or clients in order for them to access OHCS funds. However, program income may be generated in accordance with 2 CFR 200-307. Program income means gross income earned by the subgrantee and subrecipients that is directly generated by an award-supported activity or earned as a result of an OHCS award during the award period. Examples of program income may include fees collected for conference registration, exhibit booths, website advertisements, or proceeds from the sale of vehicles or equipment purchased with OHCS funds, or insurance proceeds from the theft of vehicles and equipment purchased with OHCS funds. Loans are not an allowable use of grant funds, and federal guidance stating income can be generated from the principal or interest on loans with grant funds is not applicable to any HSS funds. Except as otherwise provided by OHCS, program income does not include rebates, credits, discounts, or interest earned on any of these. Interest earned on advance of OHCS funds is also not program income. You may not earn or keep any profit resulting from an OHCS award unless expressly authorized in writing by OHCS. Program income generated from an award can be used as a deduction from the total allowable program costs, added to the OHCS award to increase funds committed to the program, used to meet the cost sharing or match requirement of the OHCS award, or used to defray program costs and reduce the state share of the program. Earned program income can be spent only on allowable costs incurred during the award period. Proceeds from the sale or theft of vehicles and equipment that occur after the award period must still be reported appropriately and used for the purposes that I just identified. Subgrantee and subrecipients cannot keep program income as a reserve, but must expend the income prior to drawing down any other award funds. Program income cannot be commingled with other awards and cannot be used for purposes outside the scope of the award that generated the income. Program income must be identified in the subgrantee or subrecipient's general ledger. Subgrantee and subrecipients must declare in advance the expectation of receiving program income in the subgrantee's funding application and must report the use of such program income in the subgrantee's annual report. Unused program income remaining 60 calendar days after the award end date must be promptly returned to OHCS. According to the United States Department of Labor, individuals may volunteer or donate their services. When they do this without contemplation of pay or profit motivation, they are not considered employees, but rather volunteers. Your HSS program standard guidance goes into much greater detail. However, I wanted to cover a few highlights and a few items. Apart from compensation, there should be little difference from the direction provided for employees and volunteers. However, there is a difference between the control an agency can provide over volunteers. Too much control over a volunteer may make them an employee under civil rights laws. In other words, train volunteers well and supervise them with a light hand. Volunteers must be allowed to refuse work and have a voice in when they work. Volunteers must not be disciplined or promised future jobs. Know your risks and the laws and regulations that dictate the treatment of volunteers. There are 3 insurance options for covering volunteers, and again, the guidance provides more in-depth information. However, you can elect no coverage, provide worker compensation coverage, or provide voluntary injury coverage. Funds cannot be expended on on paying volunteers. However, funding can be expended for the reimbursement of meal, lodging, and travel expenses for job-related activities. No gift cards, such as cash or cash equivalents, can be provided. No gifts, including gift cards, cash or cash equivalents, can be provided to volunteers. Funds cannot be expended on child care or other needs a volunteer may have in order to provide volunteer services. And with parental permission, minors may volunteer. However, there are limitations as to what they can do, such as restriction of work hours, operation of power-driven machinery, driving, arduous work restrictions, and hazardous exposures. Again, more information is available in the HSS Program Standards Guidance. The data and reporting requirements have really not changed significantly. Briefly, we still require that HMIS be used to track clients and services. We require timely reporting, and there are specific data collection requirements for emergency shelters. The universal data elements are available on our dashboard and provides a sort of crosswalk that identifies by program and activity the specific data elements that must be captured. HUD-defined victim service providers may use a comparable database that collects client-level data and generates unduplicated aggregate reports based on the data. However, data still must be reported to OHCS. You must collect and report data in accordance with your local COC and or HOA OHCS HMIS policies and procedures. If, if you have any questions related, excuse me, to data and reporting, you can connect with your COC or with OHCS's program and evaluation team. Their email address is shown on your screen. It's important to recognize that reporting must be complete and accurate when you first submit it. Any submission that is incomplete, erroneous, or submitted after the deadline will be considered by OHCS to be late and out of compliance with requirements. This means that you can't submit a report with missing data and incorrect data just to meet the deadline, as typically by the time that gets ironed out, the deadline has long since passed. Submitting accurate and timely reports is an indicator in an agency having the capacity to deliver OHCS programs. Be sure you are reviewing your data quality regularly so that you can accurately and timely report. Remain in compliance with your contract and give evidence of your agency's capacity to deliver the programs. The last program standard is about record keeping. Documentation of participant eligibility services and services provided and funded must be maintained in the participant's case file, whether that's on paper or electronically. Documentation for applicants found to be ineligible for assistance or for participants who are no longer eligible to receive assistance is required and must include the participant's request for assistance, why they are ineligible, and how it was communicated to the applicant or the participant, along with notification of the subgrantee's grievance and appeals process. Ineligible participants do not need to be entered into HMIS unless the use of HMIS is part of the subgrantee or subrecipient's intake or assessment process. File documentation will be the basis of OHCS monitoring to ensure subgrantees and subrecipients comply with program requirements, rules, and regulations. OHCS recommends that subgrantees and subrecipients use a participant file checklist to ensure adequate documentation in case files. Subgrantees and subrecipients and any of their subrecipients are required to permit OHCS, the Oregon Secretary of State's office, the federal government, and any duly authorized representative of such entities access to and the right to copy all program records, applicant participant records, and fiscal records for such purposes as research, data collection, evaluation, monitoring, and auditing. Records must be secured and maintained in accordance with program guidance. As important as retention is, the appropriate destruction of records is just as important. Records must be kept for a period of 6 years, at which time they should be destroyed. Any records still on file, even after the retention period, must still be made available for public records requests, audits, or other investigations. Be sure to destroy records in accordance with program guidance to avoid unintended liability. That wraps up this training. Don't forget to use the HSS dashboard. It really does have a lot of helpful tips and tools. I do recognize that this is also a lot of information. However, feel free to rewatch this at any time as it will remain available on our dashboard. You may also connect with us at any time if you have questions by contacting our gatekeeper at the email address shown on your screen. Thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day.